Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first ever online UWC course on social entrepreneurship. It's incredible to see so many participants from all the different corners of the world. And today we have a special privilege to hear from Rob Wilson, who is the UK director of Ashoka, who's going to tell you a little bit about his background first, and then he's going to give us a short introduction about social entrepreneurship and about Ashoka before we open the discussion to all the questions that you've asked us already and that you will be asking us throughout this event. So be sure to use the Q&A feature. Know that you can ask your questions, and then you can also rank questions that you like from others. So do not hesitate to do that, and hopefully we'll have some amazing discussion afterwards. All right. So Rob, tell us everything you know about social entrepreneurship in 20 minutes.
Great, no worries. Let me just see if I can share my my screen. And how's that?
Perfect. I can see you very well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me, and yeah, it's an honour to speak with so many UWC alumni. I had no idea that United World College existed until about a couple of years ago, and every interaction I've had since then with any staff or alumni or current students has been absolutely exceptional. So really delighted to be speaking with you today, and as a fairly recent father of a 14-month old at home, I'm going to absolutely make sure that my little boy Thomas knows all about United World College, so that he can hopefully make an application one day to go himself to one of your extraordinary colleges. So let me introduce myself very briefly. So I am Rob Wilson. So yeah, I'm the director of Ashoka here in the UK, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a background about sort of who I am first, take you through a couple of examples from my own personal experience involved in social entrepreneurship through founding a charity called Read International, and I'll give you a bit of background about that. I then wrote a book about social entrepreneurs in Africa whilst traveling from Cape Town to Cairo, and I'll give you a bit of information about that. And then for the last 4 years, have been the director of Ashoka in the UK, and I'll give you some insight into what Ashoka does, and you know, I'd love to answer any questions that you have, so that we can yeah, really address any challenges that you're currently facing, and hopefully make this as practical and engaging as possible. So first up, so 10 years ago, I founded a charity called Read International. I was a student at university at the time. I was at Nottingham Uni. A mate of mine had just been teaching in Tanzania on a gap year. I'd taken my gap year being completely useless and drinking my way around the world, and hadn't thought of doing anything particularly altruistic or useful. And this mate made me aware of just what a challenge the education system in Tanzania faced, with a shortage of books, access to literature, sort of not much of a culture of reading in schools, and so I sort of took it upon myself to start an organisation to try and address this. 10 years ago when we started, we were collecting books all over the UK that were disused. We were collecting the sort of 5th edition maths GCSE textbook. When the 6th edition came out, that 5th edition was thrown in the bin, and we collected up some books and sent them out to Tanzania and distributed them as student volunteers. The model's quite radically changed since then. So after that first year of doing that, we then decided to change the model quite considerably. We're now a network of Tanzanian university students, obviously in Tanzania, uni students who go into Tanzanian secondary schools, refurbish libraries, purchase books from local publishers and donate those purchased books, which are perfect for the syllabus and curriculum in Tanzania, to Tanzanian secondary schools, and engaging Tanzanian school students to set up library committees, take ownership over their own reading culture. And we've managed to see exam results in the schools that we've worked in go up 5 to 10% on average a year after going in, and we've seen the culture of reading hugely increase. So over the last 10 years, we've donated 1.5 million books to school kids across Tanzania, and we've refurbished libraries in close to 100 secondary schools, and we're now working in primary schools as well. The sort of innovative model here comes, I guess, in sort of various areas. So, university students have quite a lot of spare capacity. They're not studying the whole time during holidays. They have some availability, and so harnessing the energy and enthusiasm and time of Tanzanian university students during their holidays to go into schools to volunteer their time to refurbish the libraries and donate books is obviously one, I guess, innovation. Of course, the Tanzanian secondary school students are incredibly inspired by the university students coming in, rather than sort of international volunteers coming in. Actually seeing Tanzanian student volunteers coming in is incredibly inspiring. And a lot of the model is funded by book collections in the UK, and we basically collect books in the UK in book bins that you'll see dotted around the streets. And then we sell those books online, and a lot of that money generated goes to buying books locally, but the rest of the money is fundraised locally in Tanzania from CSR and things like that. But anyway, that gives you a bit of background. So I ran Read International for 5-6 years. Very happy to answer any questions about that. We had quite a lot of success and won quite a few awards, and next month we actually have our 10th anniversary. But this experience with Read International, I guess I felt, as you can see, that the evolution of the model from being one where we were UK students taking books to Tanzania, there's that element of doubt, that sort of neo-colonial model of taking British books to Tanzania, and then we radically changed it to purchasing books in Tanzania and wanted it to be entirely Tanzanian run. I myself, as a British director, felt a little bit uncomfortable being the one, working in Tanzania, running the organisation. So I decided to move on, and my wife and I got married. We took or I should say, my girlfriend and I got married and became husband and wife, and we took a sort of a honeymoon, travelling from Cape Town to Cairo. We called it our Megamoon. And we decided to spend 6 months exploring social entrepreneurship in Africa. We wanted to find African changemakers who were transforming the continent, rather than focusing too heavily on international organizations driving development projects in Africa. We wanted to find entrepreneurial solutions. We wanted to inspire others to make change. We wanted to showcase the best social entrepreneurs. At the time, this was 5 years ago. At the time, social entrepreneurship, of course, was being talked about. It's much better understood now. And back then, I guess there's a lot of business schools analyzing it, trying to define it, trying to work out exactly what is a social enterprise. What we decided to do, was just tell some stories. We thought the best way for people to understand what social entrepreneurship was to actually communicate some compelling stories. And we wanted to demonstrate that Africa was very much a continent that was on the up. We had both had a lot of experience, obviously, working in East Africa. I'd spent a lot of time in East Africa. Nikki had joined me for much of that time. And rather than presenting a continent of famine and war and disease and corruption, which is obviously what you tend to see on the mainstream press, we wanted to actually just showcase that there's a hell of a lot of innovation and many very exciting solutions in Africa. Then I'll sort of share some stories from on the up in a second, actually. And then when I got back to the UK, I joined Ashoka. So half of the social entrepreneurs that we visited in Africa were supported by this wonderful organization, Ashoka, that seemed to have an amazing knack at finding the truly extraordinary social entrepreneurs. Every time we met an individual who was supported by Ashoka, it just really struck us that they were thinking at a deep systemic level, radically trying to transform systems, changing policy, changing law, being replicated, and thinking at a much more intelligent level than perhaps some of the other great social entrepreneurs that we also met. And so I got back to London and knocked on the door of Ashoka here in the UK to really try and flog the book. I guess that was my first and foremost plan, and then ended up being offered a chance to actually work here and then lead the UK team. And Ashoka is a global network of social entrepreneurs. So we support over 3,000 individuals around the world. We provide financial support and strategic support to help extraordinary systems changing social entrepreneurs scale their impact. Sometimes it involves scaling their organization, but our focus is scaling their impact in whatever way that might be. Sometimes it's having their work replicated, copied, franchised, whatever models might be most relevant. We also do a lot of work in the education sector, and delighted that Atlantic College is actually recognized as a changemaker school, and Ashoka Changemaker School, because we do a lot of work in education to try and recognize the leading examples of academic institutions, schools and universities that are nurturing the change makers of tomorrow. And again, maybe we can talk a little bit more about that in the sort of Q&A afterwards. But rattling through, and I promise I won't speak for more than 20 minutes. I'll try to keep this concise. And so let me quickly share a story that I absolutely love. So Peter Sinkamba was one of the social entrepreneurs we met on our journey. So he is based in the Copperbelt region of northern Zambia. He would describe himself as a kind of a playboy millionaire turned environmental activist. So Peter has a very interesting story to tell, where he came from a place where at university he got involved in demonstrations. He was the president of the student union. He ended up getting kicked out of the student union for a demonstration that he got involved in. He got booted out of the university. It meant that at a time in Zambia where the universities were state-run and much of the industry was state-run, he was effectively blacklisted from getting any jobs. And so he took it upon himself to become an entrepreneur, became a very successful businessman. He was sort of importing and exporting maize or corn, and ran a very successful business, made a lot of money. And after about 10 years of making a serious amount of cash, he had a complete change of heart. And in his local town, more and more mining companies were coming into the Copperbelt region of Zambia where he lived, and they were just ripping up the earth. They were taking whatever they wanted. They were leaving things that are in a complete state of disrepair. The pollution he was seeing, the air quality was being affected. He had kids of his own that started to get affected by the air quality because these mining companies were just extracting and polluting. And they'd even be sort of digging their mine shafts underground, and on the surface, buildings were starting to get damaged and cracked. And he recognized that this was just a hugely unregulated industry. So he took it upon himself to actually represent the people of Zambia, represent the people of the Copperbelt region in court. And so he took legal action against some of these mining companies. He quit his business. He sold the company. He explained to his wife and kids that that's what he was going to do. He was going to sell the business. He told all his friends. They thought he was completely bonkers, but he did it. And so he then started taking legal action against the mining companies. He started winning some cases, and the mining companies had to start paying to repair the buildings that were being damaged on the surface. They had to start reducing the pollution. And quickly they realized, though, that he wasn't a trained lawyer. So they said, you know, you can't actually represent the people of Zambia, and the mining companies had a couple of cases overturned because he wasn't a professional lawyer, even though he'd won these cases. So he then took it upon himself to train to become a lawyer, got his qualifications, and then started winning cases again, and very quickly became recognized as a leading lawyer and practitioner fighting these environmental issues in northern Zambia. But he recognized that a way to, you know, change the system, and what the mining companies recognize, which is what makes this quite unique and interesting, is that rather than creating bad practice and then getting sued and having to pay for the reparation on the surface, or to fix the environmental damage, they just consult him from the outset. So he then turned his innovation into a consultancy organization, and advises mining companies now in Zambia, advises mining companies all across Africa, to ultimately ensure that they don't cause damage in the first instance. And so again, if anyone's got any questions about Peter, I'd love to sort of answer them. But you know, a really interesting, sustainable business model to a social issue that I think we could all learn a hell of a lot from. Next up, you've got Betty Mackel. Betty's based in Zimbabwe, an absolutely inspiring woman. Has a very sad but powerful story to share. Betty was a teacher, and when she was teaching, a young girl in her school came to her and spoke of an abuse that had happened, and said that she'd been abused. And Betty supported this girl, and, you know, did everything she could to help her. And what was sad, though, is that Betty reflected on the fact that she herself had actually been abused when she was a child, and she'd never shared it with anyone. She had never shared it with a teacher. She'd never communicated with anyone about an abuse that went on in her childhood quite frequently. And it struck her that, you know, for 20, 30 years she hadn't spoken about this thing, and this girl had come to her, and this girl had recognized that Betty was someone that she could confide in. And so what Betty did was start up a club in the school for all girls, girls only, no boys allowed, and she called it the Girl Club. And the girls could come and sing, or you know, share stories. They would write their own poetry and literature, and it would empower the girls. And very quickly, neighbouring schools started to ask for their own girl clubs as well, and so Betty started a few other girl clubs. And then, before too long, she had a network of girl-child clubs all across Zimbabwe, and it was an amazing program. Hundreds of thousands of girls involved in this empowerment project. Now, being in Zimbabwe, she actually got you know, sort of taken away by the police a few times. They were very nervous about what a woman was achieving by creating this national movement, even though it was only young girls that she was supporting. There was a lot of nervousness, and then one time she was basically given a tip-off that the next time she gets arrested and taken away by the police, it will probably be her last, and she ultimately had her life threatened. So she then fled to the UK. But again, as a true social entrepreneur, rather than sort of taking that as the end game, she saw an opportunity there. And so she seized an opportunity to take this methodology, this simple idea of starting up girl clubs in schools and empowering girls, to franchise the model. And so she franchises the Girl Child Network concept to countries all across Africa. And so now the Girl Child Network worldwide is the organization she runs from the UK, which now empowers millions of young girls all across Africa. She charges a fee to partner organizations to take on her methodology, her best practice, so that it covers her costs. And again, it's a sustainable way to create a hugely effective social movement. And she really has achieved so much. And certainly Nikki and I were bowled away at the time, and still continue to do all we can to support Betty and her girl child movement. And then finally, let me share a story about Bart. So Bart isn't, as you can probably see, one of the sort of homegrown African entrepreneurs, but it's a story that I still feel is really worth sharing. So Bart is a Belgian ex-punk rocker turned Zen Buddhist monk who trains giant African pouched rats to sniff out landmines. It doesn't get much more sort of quirky than that. And so he, as a young boy, had hamsters as a pet, and he bred hamsters to make a little bit of extra pocket money. He, used to go down to the local pet shop, became a real, fan of all things hamsters, mice, rats. And anyway, that was his sort of childhood, as you do. He then got a pretty normal job in kind of developing sort of product development, innovation in Belgium, was making some pretty good money. And about 20 years ago, was reading an article about Princess Diana and her work advocating about landmines. And in a rather peculiar way, he was reading this article about dogs that were being used to detect landmines. And traditionally, dogs are used because they can smell the TNT, the explosive in a landmine. And he remembered that rats had a very acute sense of smell. And so what he did, he thought, well, maybe we could use rats instead of dogs. And so he started up this organization called Apopo. And what they do is they train rats to detect the TNT, the explosive in a landmine, up to a few feet underground. They're light enough that they don't set off a landmine. When they detect it, they just scratch at the surface, and then you bring in the appropriate mine clearance equipment to clear the mine. Rats can be trained locally, whereas dogs are trained in the Western world by a Western trainer. You then have to fly the dog and the trainer out to where there are landmines, which is very rarely a Western world issue. And that is obviously a hugely costly process. It also doesn't create local employment, whereas his model does. And so he's able to provide a very low-cost solution to a huge issue whilst creating local employment. And rats will basically do anything for a banana. And so he realized that you can train them, they'll work away, they're kept in incredibly fantastic conditions, they sleep most of the day, and then they get out to work a little bit to clear these mines. No rats are harmed, I promise. And what he's achieving is remarkable. But he recognizes as well that not only is he clearing millions of square meters of land from landmines, he recognizes that there are other innovations that he could apply this to. So, dogs are used in airports. Dogs are used to detect drugs. Dogs are used to detect explosives. Dogs are used in emergency situations when there's an earthquake to go and find people. And you can train rats to do these things. And again, it can create local employment. They are low cost, they are cheap to keep, and you just have to feed them bananas. And so this innovation can be applied. He's also realized that they can detect tuberculosis. They can detect TB. So hundreds of years ago, before the microscope was invented, you used to actually detect tuberculosis by smelling. Even people can do it. If you have TB, your spit, your sputum will have a rather sort of potent smell. And so if you have a very acute sense of smell and you train effectively, you can just about detect it. And it turns out that scientists have quite a high sort of a low sort of success rate when it comes to detecting tuberculosis through a microscope. 90% of cases you find, but 10% sort of slip through the net. Whereas rats have a 99.9% success rate. You can train them, and they will be able to smell the tuberculosis. So you put the spit in a beaker, and the rat can sense which beaker has the TB and which one doesn't. And so he's now rolling this out with a 99.9% success rate to help millions of patients in Africa to detect tuberculosis at a much cheaper and more effective rate than the traditional healthcare system actually can. So anyway, 3 stories that I think give quite different perspectives, but show sustainable, business-minded solutions to quite serious, social issues, but show the innovation that is actually out there. So why don't I wrap up there and finish by sort of handing over to Hannah to ask if anyone has any questions.
Hi Rob, thanks so much for these incredible stories, and so different one from the other. And it's so great to see like different career changes or different pivots or just completely out of this world ideas like training rats to detect landmines. That's pretty incredible. We actually do have quite a lot of questions that are coming from the people who are watching.
Great.
So I'll start with the most popular one. And it's a question, do you think that social entrepreneurship has a place in an aid context as well as development one? And how might this role differ if it was used for aid as opposed to development?
Yeah. So I think it's maybe worth being really sort of clear about what we mean by social entrepreneurship. So as I said, at the beginning, the whole reason that I took this journey across Africa was to try and avoid definitions and things like this. But it's worth just distinguishing that we're not talking about social enterprise necessarily. So social entrepreneurs are individuals who create a sustainable solution to a social problem, a social or an environmental problem. And that doesn't necessarily need to be a business solution. It may well be quite a traditional charitable solution, but it's more innovative. It's not going to be reliant upon any one income stream. And we see a whole range of different vehicles that are ultimately used to solve social problems. For us, we're not too fussed about what the vehicle is, as long as it is genuinely sustainable and it's using an innovative approach, and it's about the individual who's driving that change forward. And what we see time and time again, and I hope those 3 examples show that what could easily be quite typical aid development organizations coming in, big INGOs maybe coming in, landmines, for example. Typically, it's an industry that's full of ex-military contractors. It's quite a corrupt industry actually, or you've got big INGOs coming in to try and solve these issues. And a little bit of innovation actually shows that you don't need to have such an aid approach. You can actually have a low-cost, sustainable business model that can be self-sustainable. Yeah.
Cool. No, that's a really good answer. So then the second most popular question revolves around your experience, and specifically what are the 3 most important things you have found support you in your work. So maybe just some inspiration about what it is that you do that helps you be effective.
Yeah, okay, so I can try to give some personal experience and then maybe try and share some examples from others as well. I mean, it's worth saying that when I mentioned Read International, and we've won some awards and we've been successful and all that stuff, and On the Up has sold quite well, and it's been a bit of a success. What I haven't done is mention my big failures, and there have certainly been some big flops along the way. And I think that some of the big learnings are about being very self-aware of what doesn't work, and then moving on. It sounds a bit cliche, but I tend to kind of think fail fast, try to just fail once, and then pick yourself up and move on. And don't start failing slowly, otherwise you start to slip into kind of 1 to 2 years of dismal failure. But I have, I've started up. I started up another social enterprise called No PC. It's an IT social enterprise. We got some pretty significant funding to get it started in the Caribbean and East Africa. It's an innovative IT solution using cloud computing. Started it about 7 years ago at a time where cloud computing was not particularly a known concept. We tried to develop a sponsorship model in order to make this sustainable. And it just didn't work. And we got the aid funding, the kind of charitable donations to kick us off. We then tried to develop a sustainable model that was going to be based on sponsorship, and we ultimately failed. We delivered computing solutions to 10 schools in East Africa and 10 schools in the Caribbean. We were very proud of what we achieved. We're very proud still of the children that are benefiting today from this solution. However, our ambition was to ultimately provide a brand new solution that was going to radically be different to PCs, and we were, very ambitious and somewhat naive, and it didn't work. And I think we recognized at the right time that this wasn't going to work, and we moved on, and we cut our losses. And so I think that's maybe one tip that I would share. Another is maybe contradictory to that. A lot of ideas will seem completely nuts and seem completely bonkers, and most people will doubt you. When you're chatting about it in the pub, it probably won't make much sense, but that also might be because it doesn't quite make sense in your head yet. And then when you articulate it and try to tell others, you're just surrounded by doubters. And I think that you just need to try to listen to those you trust, and don't turn yourself off to very useful advice. However, trust yourself. If your instinct is telling you really, like, over and over, no, there is something here, like, why do people keep doubting me? And even close friends and family might think you're nuts, but give it a go, drive it forward, because it might work. And I think it's a much more effective use of 6 months, 12 months to try and make something work, than to necessarily, I don't know, this is a bit of a personal opinion, but than to necessarily go and get a master's. Why not try and set up a project, or instead of doing an internship for 6 months or 12 months, set up an organization. If you fail, you fail, but you've learned so much. You might learn how to hire staff. If you fail, you've probably learned how to fire staff. You learn how to set up a company or a charity. You learn about finances, accounting. You learn about fundraising. You learn about investments. There's so much you'll learn even if you fail. And if you succeed, fantastic. You've then got yourself something to drive forward. So that might be another sort of second point that I would share, is just really believe in yourself and try and give it a go, because, I don't know, I mean, what's the worst that can happen?
Yeah, even the worst that happens is probably still good as a learning experience. And
yeah, and I think there's maybe the sort of the final thing, because I think what I need to also recognize is that I don't come from a particularly privileged background, but I recognize that I am privileged. When I started up Read International, I told my old man that I was going to do this, and whether I could move home for a year to live at home to try and get this started on the kitchen table. And he at the time said, he thought I was ridiculous. I'd just got a university degree. Why wasn't I going to get a proper job? But he still let me do it. And I had that resource. I had the resource to go and base myself in a very comfortable home to set this up. He would feed me and all the rest, and my mates that had proper jobs would buy me a drink and stuff like that. And so I was very fortunate. So I recognize that. However, it is worth saying that there are fantastic opportunities that now exist that didn't actually exist 10 years ago, that are really supporting you to set up organizations, to set up your own ideas. It's very easy to get hold of a few £1,000s to start up an idea. You've got people like O2 and their Think Big programs. You've got great organizations like V and V Inspired that tend to give sort of quite easy sort of cash grants of a few £100 to set up volunteer organizations. You've got Unlimited providing grants to help start up UK-based social enterprise. There are great organizations out there that will give you pretty easy cash to get started.
Cool. Thank you so much. Right now, I'm not going to ask the most popular question. I'm going to ask the one that logically follows from what we just discussed, okay. Which is funding. It's an amazing question that comes to us all the way from Colombia. Sebastian works in Colombia setting up student-led courses in rural Colombia. And one of the challenges that he's facing is just working around government funding cycles and in general the idea of attracting private investors to find some sort of financial equilibrium when you're first starting. And I want to also ask this question as a challenge, because when I was reading applications to this course, a lot of people had great ideas and they were all like, I need funding, cannot do this without funding. So what's your opinion about this? What's the funding required to start a social enterprise, and how do you deal if you are running already a bigger operation? How do you deal with these cycles of government funding and finding financial equilibrium?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on your it depends on your model. So if you're genuinely setting up a social enterprise and there's a business model there, and you have a sustainable business proposition, then you've got different options, haven't you? You can go to the bank and try and get a loan, or you can try and go to investors to try and raise debt or equity. So either getting a loan or basically sort of selling a stake in your business. If you do have a social enterprise, there are so many places you can go to get cash, because venture capitalists exist the world over. If it's a sustainable social enterprise that's going to turn over a profit, even if it's a small profit, there will be people very hungry to give you cash if it's got a sensible business model behind it. But that's again why it's worth being quite specific about, is it really a social enterprise with a sustainable business model, or are you a social entrepreneur who has an idea that's going to create great social change, but perhaps at the moment it isn't a sustainable business, and that's absolutely fine, and you just need a bit of grant funding to get you going, or you need some donations to just kick it off, and perhaps in 3 years time or 5 years time, maybe then you'll have a sustainable business model, but you just know it's very unlikely to happen for the next 3 to 5 years. Now, if that's what we're talking about, which I suspect it might be, then you need to, again, this is maybe stating the obvious, but it's like, bootstrap. You need to stay lean. You need to stay cheap and low cost. If you do have your hands on a laptop, that is basically your resource that you're going to need to sort of get something started. You need to get your invoices started. If you are delivering a service that you're planning to sell in some way, shape or form, get your first invoice done and out the door. Or if you're planning to raise some cash, then you do just need to get out there and start asking the right people. Ashoka, we have a website called changemakers.com where we're regularly running competitions and providing cash grants to some of the best ideas out there. And we're one of many that are really keen to globally support innovation. And of course, there'll be local foundations. It's about doing your research, and sometimes it's pretty dry and boring, and you have to go to the library. I spent so much time in libraries in my first few months, just picking up sometimes it's going through books of foundations or trusts that I could apply to, or it's doing the diligent research about which corporations will be interested in supporting this, or the diligent research about which individuals are going to be interested in doing this. You will not raise money by just going around and having conversations with people and hoping for the best and asking your friends and friends of friends to maybe spot you a bit of cash. Like, you are going to need to do proper hard work, research, and then present a compelling plan. Sometimes, if you're a little bit charismatic, you might be able to charm someone out of a little bit of money, and fair enough, good luck to you, that's great. But at the same time, you have to back it up with a sensible strategy, a sensible plan. Now, I would definitely say that don't spend too much time on a super detailed 5-year business plan, because as soon as you've written it, it's out of date, things change. You're probably going to come up with another idea that might be a bit better and tweak and adapt. But you've got to have something on paper. You've got to have some kind of 1, 3, 5-year plan. So you've got to invest some time in it. And I think that, from what I see time and time again, every day I'm meeting great social entrepreneurs, but I'm also meeting some quite weak social entrepreneurs. And I think that what distinguishes some of the stronger ones from some of the weaker ones is maybe the difference between a dreamer and a doer. And there are those that dream and are very good at talking about it, and they've got this idea, and they want you to just back them. But you're like, well, you've got to do something first. You've got to prove it. You've got to get something on paper. Go start delivering that social impact that you're talking about, rather than purely telling me about the social impact that you could deliver.
Great, great, great. So now I will revert back to the most popular question, which is, what is, and if there is, the right time to become a social entrepreneur? Should you start when you're young and you've just graduated from college, or should you wait until a bit later when you have some specific skills that you can bring to the table?
Yeah, so I think what I would say is that it's not necessarily something to plan quite like that. I don't know, like, so there's a big, this is maybe a daft thing to say to an audience that are trying to learn about how to be a social entrepreneur, but there's a rise in popularity about wanting to be a social entrepreneur, but you should only want to be a social entrepreneur if you have a specific social issue that you're really trying to change and address. Is there something you're really passionate about? And then it's about turning that passion into action, rather than just thinking, I want to be a social entrepreneur. So if there's a social issue that you're desperate to solve, then think about what's the most effective way to solve that social issue, not what's the most effective way to be a social entrepreneur. Because the most effective way to solve that issue might not necessarily mean starting up your own organization. It might mean driving amazing change as a change maker within an existing organization. It might even be a business. You might be able to go and join a company, get a great job, and drive social change from within that business, or go and join government and drive social change within government, or go and join another social entrepreneur and another not-for-profit and drive change. Or it might mean setting up your own social enterprise or your own organization. So it's just, I guess, give yourself permission to not necessarily be a social entrepreneur. You can be incredibly entrepreneurial, you can be a change maker without necessarily needing to set up your own organization. So that's just like one thing to maybe flag. If you do have a social problem that you're desperate to solve, then now is probably the time. Don't necessarily think that you need to go and get a job, you need to go and get 3 to 5 years of experience, because if there's something you need to solve, then solve it now, because if it's important, if lives are being affected by it, then you owe it to those that are affected to start solving that issue with them and for them, and working together. Yeah, but having said that, again, give yourself permission if you do want to go and get some experience elsewhere. I'm not a great sort of case study. I started when I had bugger all experience. 10 years ago at university, I didn't have any experience of working for someone else. I'd only ever sort of worked for myself, and that's all I've done sort of until I guess relatively recently joining a global organization like Ashoka. But thankfully that allows a very entrepreneurial approach. I hope that sometimes helps and doesn't just sort of ignore the question.
No, I think it definitely helps. I especially really liked how you almost reshaped the question. Instead of saying what it takes to be a social entrepreneur, you brought it back to its core, which is what does it mean to be one, and having this passion and having this need to solve a social problem. So I think that's a wonderful way to actually both define who is a social entrepreneur and how to best become one.
Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe an interesting example of, because it is fair enough. If you do really want to be a social entrepreneur and you don't yet have an idea that you're super passionate about, then I do know an interesting, it's a bit gimmicky, but an interesting idea, an interesting methodology as to how to find an issue that you might be passionate about. So go, maybe sit down with a bunch of friends and pick up a local newspaper, and everybody have that local newspaper. Everyone get a copy of the national newspaper, and everyone get an international newspaper. And you basically look through the local newspaper, you all turn the pages at the same time, turn the pages, and you're just looking at headlines. And basically, newspapers are full of negative news. You will very rarely see a nice, lovely, positive news story. So you will see social issue after social issue after social issue. You will read about knife crime, gun crime, pollution. You're going to read about finance issues, corruption. You're going to read about so much destitution, either on a local, national, or international level. You know, the media is out there to terrify us into buying another newspaper. And so if you read the newspapers, that might actually spark some passion. There's a great social entrepreneur called Charles Maisel in South Africa who developed this methodology. I've got great respect for Charles, and he works with students to basically solve social issues this way. One time they were doing this, and they're looking through the newspapers, and there's a township in Cape Town called Lavender Hill. And he asked the kids that he was doing this with, you know, why is Lavender Hill called Lavender Hill? And they all look around and say, we've got no idea. And this article was about the huge amount of gun crime in Lavender Hill. And so he said, well, is there actually any lavender there? And they said, no, we've never seen any lavender. So he's like, well, why on earth is it called Lavender Hill? Why don't we make Lavender Hill like really proud? Why don't we make the population super proud and just cover the whole place in lavender? And then we'll start up a business, and we'll harvest the lavender, and we'll sell lavender oils, lavender soaps, lavender products. And so he engaged hundreds of kids in this community who were otherwise getting involved in crime to basically plant lavender all along the sides of motorways, highways, roads, in parks, in school playgrounds. The whole place is now covered in lavender. It's radical. And kids are involved in harvesting it and turning it into products, and they have a deal now with a national retailer to sell these lavender products in shops all across South Africa. So that just shows that a fairly simple gimmicky idea of looking through local newspapers, if you find a social issue that you're actually passionate about, you may well be able to develop quite an interesting product or project and solution.
Really great example. And to follow on this conversation about who is a social entrepreneur, what is a social enterprise, we've compared it to aid and NGOs, but now the question is about the difference in social enterprise and just a regular enterprise. What do you think makes the difference, as also just enterprises are trying to help people in different ways? If there is any differences in which you would seek funding for an enterprise versus for a social enterprise?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. With my my sort of Ashoka hat on, I know obviously work very closely with the founder Bill Drayton, who's famed for founding the concept of social entrepreneurship 35 years ago, and what he gets increasingly frustrated about is if he's ever introduced on stage, he speaks at conference after conference, and if he's introduced on stage as the founder of social enterprise, he's just that in the pit of his stomach, he just feels sick to the core, because he does not want to be known as the person that founded social enterprise. And it kind of comes back to this thing that what we want to promote is social entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial, innovative solutions to social problems that aren't necessarily social enterprises. They don't have to be these sustainable social businesses. And if they genuinely are sustainable social businesses, then it's very likely that you have a whole wealth of opportunity to get yourself funding. And like I've said previously, you can go to the bank, you can go to investors, you can go to venture capitalists, because if it genuinely is a business solution. And I think that what we distinguish at Ashoka is if your primary focus is to solve the social problem, then that's the distinguishing factor. If you're out there to make a lot of money at the same time, I think it becomes quite complicated. And we see this, in our network of 3,000 Ashoka fellows. At the point where we support an Ashoka fellow, they are 99% of the time not for profit. We might help them develop a more sustainable business model, but at the point that we interject and that we help them, they are not for profit, because if they were for profit and if they were a genuine business model, there's other places they can go for support. We want to get behind people that have a radically different approach to solving a social problem. And so that's maybe sort of one thing to kind of share as an anecdotal sort of example. I hope that helps answer the question. I somehow feel it might not have.
No. Go to venture capitals if you're a business and try to look for other places like Ashoka or other organizations supporting kind of NGO not-for-profit models if you don't have that sustainable business model. So
yeah, I think the big difference, and it really is about like if your primary focus is like on the social good and the social change that you're trying to create, and that's it's a hard thing to capture and distinguish. What is your motivating factor? Part of Ashoka's selection criteria that we have is a term we call ethical fiber. So again, it's not something you can put in an application form. You can't ask someone, how ethical are you? It's about trustworthiness. It's about your motivations, what drives you. And so if your drive is the social change, and that's your motivating factor, and it's not ego driven, and again, that's an interesting concept about this emergence of people wanting to be social entrepreneurs. Is that because they're driven by a social problem that they truly want to solve? Or is there an ego at play? Is it that they want to be perceived to be a social entrepreneur? They want to be seen as a social entrepreneur. Now that's an interesting concept, because if you become ego-driven, then are you really motivated by the right reasons, and are you therefore going to be able to create the right social change? Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of great social entrepreneurs, of course, they have an ego. I certainly have a bit of an ego. You can ask any of my colleagues, and they'll be the first to tell you that Rob's far from the sort of angelic person that has no ego. But I think it's important to find the right balance and certainly be motivated by the right causes.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that the core of social entrepreneurship is that issue of a social issue. So what specifically are those social issues that social entrepreneurs have to change? And maybe I will give an example, because obviously say like a company like Google, it also has a mission to the world and an objective, which is to bring information to people. And I would argue that that is a social mission, and I would argue that that is a social goal. But obviously, it was funded as an for-profit company. So where do you draw the line of what is an issue, and is it the severity of the issue? Is it the helplessness of people affected by it? What makes a social issue worthwhile for a social entrepreneur to handle, as opposed to just an entrepreneur?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, actually. Maybe I've got a quite interesting sort of example to offer, because just for lunch today, I met with one of our Ashoka fellows here in the UK, Maisie Mackel, Rufus Pollock, and Rufus is the founder of an organisation called Open Knowledge. He's the pioneer of open knowledge, and it's a sort of an open data movement. And so Google's a very interesting example. Whilst that is their mission statement, they are far from open. They own everything. That information that they're gathering, they are owning, and they are capitalizing on it. They're not just making information, freely available. They are absolutely trying to capitalize on that information monopoly that they have. Whereas what Rufus is saying is we should all have free access to information if it serves the common good. And there's plenty of information that huge corporations like Google will absolutely hold on to capitalize on and profit on, rather than necessarily releasing free of charge for the common good. And so other examples of where corporations hold on to data, hold on to information, you've got medical research, for example. So drug companies will hold on to all of the information about the medical trials to have one up against the other drug company that's also doing medical trials. If you actually made that information freely available, you could have huge advances in drug treatment, in medical treatment, much quicker than we currently have, because of the ownership of data and keeping hold of data. If Google were involved in that space, they would absolutely be holding on to that data to profit on that data. Crime statistics, we should absolutely have free access to crime statistics so that we can see what's actually happening in our communities. What Rufus has managed to do is make changes in the law, changes in the policy to make sure that some of those statistics are now freely available, and you can then download an app and you can see crime rate in your street and things like this. So this huge movement in trying to create open knowledge, open data. How do you ensure that Tesco's, rather than trying to profit on, or Walmart, or I realize speaking to a global audience, but global brands and supermarkets that hold on to data for billions of people around the world, how do you make sure that that data isn't just being capitalized on, is actually used for some kind of common good? Now that's the distinguishing factor. That's what makes Rufus a great social entrepreneur, and he easily could be a Silicon Valley billionaire. This guy's a tech genius, but he wants to use his abilities to drive good and change government policy on giving people access to information, rather than organizations, corporations monopolizing on that information. The internet was supposed to create an open, free, fair society, but if you think about it, there are not many corporations that have a huge monopoly over most of the web presence. Google is one, Facebook of course is another. Facebook is trying to provide free internet to the world, but you then have to go through Facebook. That's terrifying, that you'd have to go through Facebook to then access the web, but we're already doing that through Google. So anyway, that's maybe an example of where you would distinguish between a very successful business entrepreneur and a social entrepreneur trying to think about things differently.
Great. Interesting perspective. So the next question is actually a personal one relating to your personal experience working for Ashoka, and I guess also for Reed. So what are your suggestions for identifying a minimum viable product? And the comment, it actually sometimes takes quite a long time to fail fast. And how do you then make sure that that exhaustion that does not take over your ability to continue iteration?
Yeah, so I think that sort of exhaustion, that burnout, is definitely a risk, and I think it's very important to take care of yourself, take care of your own personal well-being, however that is that you want to do that. We have a program now within Ashoka where we're providing well-being support, coaching, personal support to the social entrepreneurs that we're working with, rather than just assuming that they can drive their change forward, continuously without actually thinking for themselves, thinking of themselves. So that's one thing that I would, absolutely stress and emphasize, is that you have to look after yourself, and you have to think about what you need and what motivates you to carry on doing it. You can't be purely, obviously, altruistic and only think of others. And then I think you had a first question as well that I've forgotten.
No. This was just a setup of the question about your personal experience and how did you work to define this minimal viable product, and how did you not get burnout when you were doing this first project?
And I think it's a lot of trial and error. You're not going to get it right straight away. And with Reed International, we thought we had a great model, and we were collecting tens of thousands of books in the UK that were being disused, and that was good, but they were maybe only matching the syllabus in Tanzania 50%, and we were making an impact, but it wasn't as much of an impact as we could have made. And we were using university students from the UK to go over to Tanzania. It was good, but it wasn't the model that we've got now 10 years on. The model developed and evolved, and it's about being open-minded to that change. What's a better model? Not just being stubborn and thinking that first idea you had is the idea that you're going to stick with. You have to listen to those around you that are saying there's another way here. You have to listen to those doubts in your head as well, that maybe this isn't the perfect way. Do not be stubborn-minded. Do not be proud. You have to accept that there are changes and improvements, and I think that's very important.
Great. Thank you so much for patiently answering all of the questions that we all had for you. And thank you so much for taking an hour of what I'm sure is a very busy day for you, and for speaking to all of us. And thank you for everyone for viewing and for your great questions. And I'm looking forward to the rest of our 5-week course, and hopefully by the end of it we'll also have some examples of social enterprises that came out of the discussions that we had in that small community, a relatively small community of learners. So thanks so much.
You're very welcome, and I appreciate that there might be some questions that haven't been answered. So please feel free to drop me a tweet. I am Robert Wilson is my handle, and yeah, do just feel free to drop me a question. I'll try and get back to you.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.